Hi, listeners. This is Sarah with a message from the cruising team. As you might already know, we're an independent podcast. So if you want to support the work we're doing, you can donate to us at buymeacoffee.com/cruisingpod. Additionally, if you're looking to hire an audio engineer, an editor, or producer, you can reach out to us directly at cruisingpod@gmail.com. And as always, please follow, subscribe, and leave us a glowing review on your podcast app if you haven't already. It really helps with exposure. Thank you so much for listening. Here's the episode. Welcome back to Cruising the Archives. My name is Sarah Gabrielli, and our subject this week is Lillian Faderman, a world-renowned lesbian and LGBT scholar and author. Lillian has written a dozen books on the subject, including Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers and Surpassing the Love of Men. You should recognize her name from our previous episodes. We've quoted this interview a bit in Season 2 and also released an earlier virtual interview with her as a bonus episode back in Season 1. But this episode is new material that we recorded in person with Lillian while on the West Coast last year. She welcomed Rachel and I into her gorgeous San Diego home, and the three of us talked extensively about her expertise in 20th century lesbian history and culture, as well as stories from her own life. The following is an abridged version of that interview.
From the time I was 11 to the time I was 15, I had this huge crush on the woman who was the executive director of a place that was called Theater Arts Workshop. You know, I think Eileen, who's called Irene in my memoir, is no longer with us. She would be over 100 if she were, and I think she's not, so I think it's okay if I use her real name. So she was the executive director of Theater Arts Workshop. I grew up from the time I was 8 years old in Boyle Heights in East LA. And it was a working class neighborhood. It must have been 1951 or early 1952. And I had wanted to be an actress. And it was an inspiration from Hollywood movies and from my mother saying that I needed to rescue her from her work. She was in the garment worker, a garment worker. She would tell me to, Lily, rescue me from the shop. It would be a constant refrain. And I didn't think she took it seriously, but then we moved to Hollywood. We moved to Los Angeles, I should say, where the movie industry was. And so why was she telling me that if she didn't take it seriously? So my big dream was to be an actress. I had no idea how you would do that from Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles. So I discovered that this place called Theater Arts Workshop was opening up, and it hadn't even opened. And I met the woman who called herself the executive director. Her husband was the acting director. And she was gorgeous to my eyes. I'd never seen in person anything like Eileen. And I fell madly in love with her. I was 11 and a half, and that continued until I left Boyle Heights when I was 15. And I was very troubled by my crush. And so I would go to the library, the Malabar Library, right across the street from Theater Arts Workshop on Wabash Avenue. I would have done absolutely everything for her. And I would go to the library and somehow I'd heard the word homosexual, and I would look it up in these psychology books for adults. And I'd read things like young girls must be warned about older women who try to get too close to them because the older women might be homosexual. And I remember thinking, oh, if only Eileen were a homosexual. But she wasn't. But I was very troubled by it. But somehow I didn't think of myself as being a homosexual. And I think I also had crushes on boys in high school. Not so much crushes, perhaps, as wanting to be popular enough to be dated by a boy. So I didn't think of myself certainly as part of a community. I don't think I knew there was a community. And then I had already moved, and I remained friends with this guy that I met in Boyle Heights. And Eddie was 3 years older than I was, and he and Bobby Vera, whose brother had actually been a famous child actor, Ricky Vera, of the time, they did what they called female impersonation to records. They lip synced to records, and they were included for a little while in some of the shows that Eileen put on, where I was the MC. And Eddie finally came out to me as being homosexual, so I heard that word again, but I didn't apply it to myself. By then, I lived in the Beverly Fairfax area, and I lied about my age and joined Geller Theater. I was 15 by then, and with the other adult students at Geller, sometimes on the weekends, we would go to beaches in Los Angeles and walk by what I realized later was a gay beach. And there was one place where I saw a couple of lesbians outside. One was feminine, one was masculine, and they had a dog, and the masculine one was calling to the dog and said, "Come to Papa." And it scared me. And I remember walking with these guys who were probably gay, I don't know, but I imagine in retrospect they were, and grabbing the arm of one of them. I mean, it was just this learned homophobia, despite the fact that I'd had this tremendous crush on Eileen since I was 11 years old. I didn't associate that with being a lesbian. Eddie came back into my life a year later. I don't remember how he contacted me again. Maybe we had stayed in touch for that year. And I met him a couple of times. And he said, "Do you want to come with me to places I've discovered where people like me hang out?" And I was really excited about it, not because I thought I was like Eddie, didn't make the connection, but I said, "Sure." And so he took me he got a phony ID for me.
Sorry, how do you get a phony ID in those days?
I think he knew people who were old. My first ID was, it was a birth certificate that somebody lent him. It said that I was 22.
Great.
Yeah, and later on I got a better phony ID because I knew a guy who was a printer, and he made me a very neat driver's license that had my real name, but said that I was still 22. I was 22 for a very long time.
Until you turned 23.
And then so we went to a couple of gay male bars, and then he said, and there are places like this for girls too. And I remember saying, "Oh, really?" And he took me to the Open Door on 8th and Vermont. And I walked in, and first I thought, what was Eddie talking about? There are boys and girls here. It's not a place for gay girls, as he'd said. And then I realized the boys were actually butches. And then I realized this is where I wanted to be. And then I came back the next day. I didn't drive, of course. I had to take 2 buses to get there. And I don't know how the hell I thought I would get home that night, but I relied on meeting someone, and I did, who then drove me home. And it sort of became my hangout for a while. That was the summer of 1956. And then I transferred to Hollywood High School, and I kept going for a while. And then I was going to drop out of school. I mean, I was really sort of a juvenile delinquent. And I met a butch, Jan Claremont. I'm sure it wasn't her real name, but that was the name she told me. She was from New Orleans, and she actually wanted to turn me out into prostitution. And she said, "If you'll do that, we can get a motorcycle and we'll drive to New Orleans I'll take you back to New Orleans with me. And for a little while, I thought, well, should I do it? And then I realized I couldn't. And I looked in the yellow pages, and I looked under psychologists or psychiatrists, I don't know what. And I called one. He gave me the telephone number of the social worker, and I met him at the end of the summer. And he said, if you want to be a lesbian, that's fine, but you're going to have to support yourself. He discovered that I loved to read plays, and he gave me books. And he said that you could go to college and you could have a career and go back to school. And he said, I'll get you permission to only go half day. It was like a medical excuse in effect, since he was a social worker. So I went half day that semester, but I also discovered the speech club. And since I had had 4 years of, more than that, 5 years of dramatic training, I realized that's what I wanted to do, and I did very well in the speech club. So for that semester, I had to hang around from noon until 3 o'clock, just making myself busy because I didn't have classes. So I became enamored of school, and for a while, I was scared to go back to the open door. Then I got my courage back again, and then I discovered that there were bars that were less likely to be raided. I don't remember who took me to the Club Laurel, the upscale bar, that bar, a cocktail lounge. It wasn't by any means a bar. It was a cocktail lounge. And so I started going there and met people who weren't ostensibly into butch and femme. And then I realized there was another strata of lesbian life in the 1950s.
And so what about your family? Like, when were they made aware of your lifestyle?
I didn't have a father. My mother didn't marry the guy who was my father. So I was brought up by my mother, and sometimes my very beloved aunt was part of us. And they were immigrants from Latvia. My mother came in 1914. My aunt came in 1923. My mother loved American movies, but was really not very sophisticated. My aunt didn't even love American movies. At one point, I remember telling my aunt that I loved women, and her response was, "Don't be silly, there's no such thing." And she told me, "I'll meet a man and I'll fall in love and get married, and that'll be okay." And it's really strange that she said, "Don't be silly, there's no such thing," because she had been married when we lived in New York. She had been married when I was 4 or 5 years old. And I remember really loving the man she was married to. And she divorced him. But when I was an adult, she told me that she divorced Harry Gilman because, quote, when he was younger, he met a man who spoiled him for women. So she knew male homosexuals existed. She didn't know that word, but when I told her that I loved women, she said, "Don't be silly, there's no such thing." And my mother had, she worked every day to support us. She worked in the garment industry, but her family had disappeared in the Holocaust, and she really had emotional problems, and she would have been quite out of touch, and she didn't know. She didn't know from female homosexuality, although she told me at one point that shortly after she came to this country, she worked in a shop making dresses, and she got pneumonia, and she was visited in the hospital by a friend who worked with her, and she said, and she kissed me all over. She wouldn't stop kissing me in the hospital. But she never made the connection between that and homosexuality. It was just something that was annoying to her. So neither my mother nor my aunt would have pressured me to stop being a homosexual because there's no such thing. So.
Right. That's so interesting.
So in some ways, I was lucky, I guess, although my aunt pressured me to get married and to get out of the house. I married a gay man. I married Mark.
Yeah, can you tell the story behind that?
So I actually met him at the Club Laurel. I had gone there with Frankie, not only with Frankie, but with a guy who had been in the military. He came to Los Angeles, but he was the one, I guess, that had heard about the Club Laurel. And he took me and Frankie, who was my partner, I guess, in those days. He took me and Frankie there. And he had been in Mazatlan where he met Mark. And he saw Mark in the bar and he said, "Oh, I know that guy." And he introduced us. And Mark, we had the same coloring. We kind of looked similar. And Al or Frankie remarked on it. And we hit it off. He said he wanted to take me to concerts. And I imagine he wanted a front. And then we were friends for, I don't know, maybe 6 months, maybe 9 months. My mother met him, and he was much older than I was. In fact, he was twice my age. I was 17, and he was 34. But my mother wanted to know why I was dating him, and I said, well, we might get married. And, of course, he had said nothing about that, but he called me, and I said, and I just told my mother we might get married. And he said, why not? And we did. We got married. Didn't last very long. He had been such a great friend, but as husband and wife, we were not good together. It turned out he was an alcoholic, and I suspected that. But anyway, this is really off track and more detail than you want. So
it's not more detail than we want, but
ask another question.
Okay. Can we start with sort of the pre-World War II LGBTQ community in the U.S., like the 1910s, 20s, and 30s? Obviously, that's a big question, but can you kind of talk about what the community in Hollywood was like?
Yeah, so Hollywood, of course, attracted bohemian types because it attracted actors, and they came from all over the world. From Berlin, for instance, where things were pretty open for lesbians and gay men and people that we would call trans today, or Paris, where things were certainly open. It was a community that was not at all conventional and was far beyond what most Americans would have thought acceptable. So they were drawn to Hollywood because of the movie industry in the early 20th century, in the teens and in the 1920s. And they found their own places to amuse themselves. In the 1920s, of course, there couldn't be bars that served alcohol, but there were speakeasies and there were clubs, lounges. Drag was very much in the 1920s. BBB's Cellar was a place that advertised itself as a nightclub where boys will be girls, meaning that there was drag entertainment, but they often had waitresses or people who were what we would call non-binary today, who were assigned female at birth, as we would say today, who dressed in tuxedos, for instance. For the most part, they got away with it, but there were occasional raids in the 1920s. Jimmy's Backyard was raided. BBB's Cellar was raided. There were even more raids once Prohibition came to an end in the 1930s. But interestingly enough, there were cocktail lounges for lesbians, women that we would certainly call lesbians today, like Tess's Cafe International on the Sunset Strip, and Jane Jones, and women could dance together. There was a lot of what we would call today non-binary presentations. Of course, these were not terms that were available in the 1930s, but many of the patrons, people assigned female at birth, might wear tuxedos, and they would dance with other patrons, also assigned female at birth who identified as female, who wore long gowns. To my knowledge, Tess's Cafe International and Jane Jones and places like that, upscale places, were never raided. And who knows why that was? That might have been because they paid the police off. It might have been because the Sunset Strip was unincorporated. It later became part of West Hollywood, but in those days it was an unincorporated town. And the sheriffs and police vigilance was much less what it was in Los Angeles itself. In any case, those were very glamorous kinds of places. Marlene Dietrich would hang out at those places, and there were apocryphal stories, but I tend to believe them, that the drag entertainers such as Tommy Williams and Jimmy Renard would croon to those famous entertainers. There's a story about how Marlene Dietrich was serenaded by Tommy Williams, who came right up to her and sang to her, and she was very much into it. The glamour of that is really sort of quite lovely. So during the 1930s, there were several places like that, and they continued even into the 40s.
And it was like socially acceptable for these kind of Hollywood stars to hang out in these spaces, or
it was socially acceptable in Hollywood, but they really had to be discreet as far as the general public was concerned. Hollywood kind of invented the lavender marriage or the twilight marriage, which they were front marriages. The silent film star Alla Nazimova had a front marriage with a gay man, for example. It's well known now that her real relationships were lesbian relationships with other women. There were other silent film stars of the 1920s, such as Lillian Teschman, who had a front marriage with another gay man. This was really quite common in the 1920s among stars who were lesbian, to disguise their sexuality through front marriages, lavender marriages, twilight marriages. All of those terms were coined in the 1920s to disguise their own sexuality with marriages, usually to gay men. And sometimes those marriages were arranged by the studios to keep from the public what was really going on with these stars they adored. It was perceived in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and beyond that if it was known that a star was homosexual, which was the operative word at that time, a career would be ruined. And so studios insisted that stars be discreet. And I think for the most part, they cooperated. There are stories of careers being ruined. Elizabeth Scott, for instance, was a wonderful actress in the 1940s, and it got out that she was a lesbian, and that was virtually the end of her career. She wouldn't tolerate a front marriage. She was interviewed for the media. There were all of these slick magazines that went around the country about the lives of Hollywood stars. And of course, she was asked questions like, "Why aren't you married?" She would never say specifically, "Because I'm a lesbian," but she would say, "I'm just having too much fun now, and maybe marriage is sometime off in the future." But once it was leaked that she was indeed a lesbian, that was kind of the end of Liz Scott. She had made something like more than a dozen movies in a few years. And once her reputation was ruined because it was known that she was a lesbian, I think she made 3 more movies, and that was the end of her Hollywood career. But gay men and lesbians often socialized together, and it permitted them to go to places where they couldn't have gone alone, like some upscale nightclubs, for instance, or where they would have been conspicuous, such as upscale restaurants. And so very often gay men and lesbians who were friends would go together as heterosexual couples. I love some stories I was told in the interviews that I did for my book, Gay LA, which I co-authored with Stuart Timmons. Some of those stories were about people who would call themselves part of the cufflink crowd. And what they meant by that is that men would dress up very elegantly and go with lesbian friends to these very fancy restaurants. And in the car, they would arrive, 2 men sitting together, 2 lesbians sitting together, often cuddling in the back seat. And when they get out of the car, one of the interviewees said before they would get out of the car, he would tell everyone, "Okay, now boy, girl." And they would walk into these restaurants and presumably heterosexual couples. And then they'd get back into the car after dinner or whatever. And he would say, "Okay, now boy, girl." And they would go back into the real couples that they were. And this happened often. I, as a young lesbian, was asked to help someone pass. The man, a friend of mine, worked for the gas company. He wasn't part of the cufflink crowd. He was part of Pacific Gas and Electric. And they had Christmas parties, and he would ask me to be his date to a Christmas party. And so I would get all dressed up, and he would get all dressed up in a nice suit and tie, and I would wear a dress and high heels, and he would introduce me to people at the Christmas party as his fiancée. So it was common when a gay person or a lesbian had to pass to find a friend of the opposite sex who was also part of the community to help them pass. I even was invited to lunch by a friend who became a famous drag queen, Destiny. Destiny and I were friends when for a while Destiny would hang out with the gay crowd on Hollywood Boulevard. And he would have lunch with his mother on some Saturdays or Sundays. And once he invited me to lunch, presumably to give his mother some hope that he had turned heterosexual. I don't know. In any case, I dressed up femme and came to lunch with Destiny and his mother on a weekend. And I don't think I was the first female who did that.
Wow. So you did that a lot. Like you did that with a number of different men.
With several different gay men. Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's because it was in the 1950s. so scary and so dangerous to be as the term was, homosexual. People would certainly present as gay if they were butches at night. It was a little more dangerous to do it on the job, although I did know women who worked in factories who were very butch and couldn't disguise and didn't want to disguise who they were.
How did then sort of post-World War II the culture shift and like raids are so much more prominent and it's sort of very much in the public eye?
Yeah, I think that there were certainly many raids of bars that catered particularly to gay men in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. The bars that catered to women tended to be much more upscale and really flew beneath the radar for the most part. With the war and the fact that more and more women were going into the workforce, despite the feminine mystique of the 1950s, because women went into the workforce, they had money of their own, not a lot of money, but enough to go to bars and a larger spectrum of the socioeconomic lesbian community was able to go to bars. More bars opened beginning in the late 1940s and the 1950s that catered primarily to working class and young women and women who were very often presented themselves as butch and femme and not wearing tuxedos, but wearing butches wearing the kinds of clothes that young men would generally wear. The post-war years were a period of such conformity. It's well known that the Rosie the Riveter image of the war, that women got out of the home and made their own money and did things that was virtually inconceivable for women to do during World War II. There was a real push to send women back to the home after the war. And of course, lesbians defied that push. But there was such an era of conformity in the post-war years. And lesbians were sort of the epitome of nonconformists. I came out as a teenager in 1956. And it was probably the worst time in the world to come out as a lesbian. The worst time in history, I should say, because there was such conformity and there was such a crackdown on lesbian bars in the lesbian community. And so it was not at all uncommon in big cities such as Los Angeles for the Vice Squad to raid lesbian bars. They were even worse with gay male bars, but pretty scary in lesbian bars as well. A bar could be raided if an undercover Vice Squad officer discovered that there were women kissing in the bar, women dancing in the bar, or women with their arms around each other in the bar. And many bars were raided. And I think owners of bars became very nervous. I remember being at the Club Laurel, which was an upscale cocktail lounge in North Hollywood in the late 1950s. And I went there with another woman, and I just affectionately put my arm around her. And Beverly Shaw came up to me and said, "You want to get me arrested? Take your arm off." And I did, of course. It was also dangerous to be in what we used to call drag, but these days, of course, we would say it was gender non-binary dress or trans dress. But as a historian, I ran into many stories of people who were assigned female at birth, who dressed in masculine apparel, who were stopped on the streets by the police and really hassled. It wasn't, or should not have been in any case, considered illegal, because although Los Angeles had cross-dressing laws from the late 19th century, those laws were challenged by 2 cases in 1950 of people who were assigned female at birth, who dressed in masculine apparel, who challenged being arrested for cross-dressing, and they both won their cases. But despite that, the police and the vice squad kept after people who seemed to be cross-dressing and arrested them. There are wonderful stories of people like Nancy Valverde, for instance, who just, Nancy just kept challenging it, and this was even into the 1950s when those 2 cases were declared in favor of the people who were supposedly cross-dressing. They were still very hostile, and of course, working-class lesbian bars in particular were raided. There were upscale lesbian bars in the 1950s and the 1960s that didn't seem to have that problem with the law.
And that seemingly class-related. Like, do you think it's like they had some sort of power and connections at those other places?
Well, I think it was class-related. I think it would have been a little harder to get away with hassling some of the women who frequented those bars because they might have had money and influence. At the Club Laurel, alas, there were straight people who came to look at the lesbians, I guess, to observe the queers. And maybe that was encouraged by Beverly Shaw because it was financially lucrative. But maybe it was also encouraged because it kept the cops away, because it seemed to be a mixed cocktail lounge. But to my knowledge, in any case, and I frequented the bar, the cocktail lounge, I should say, in the late 50s and the early 60s, there was never any hassle by the police or the vice squad. I should say, though, that I'm haunted by something that I observed at the Open Door, which had been my first bar and was for a while my favorite bar, in 1956. And that is going to the Open Door one afternoon. They were open on the weekends in the afternoons, and seeing at the end of the bar a policeman sitting and drinking a beer. Now, what the hell was that about? I don't know. And he was chatting. The owners, the owners of the Open Door were. It was this little old couple, and the women who frequented the bar often called them Mom and Pop, and the policeman was chatting with the owners, and I have no idea what that was about. It just struck me as being so interesting that he wasn't hassling anyone. He seemed to be friends of the owners, but I can't help but think maybe he was there for a payoff. I don't know. But that's not to say that the bars in the 1950s and 60s were happy places because they weren't harassed. I mean, they were happy places because they were home to so many of the lesbians who frequented those places, but they were certainly harassed by the police. There were frequent raids. I think the lesbians who went to those bars had reason to worry. It's not that they stayed away, because those bars, for many of them, were the only game in town. They wouldn't stay away, but you risk being arrested. You risk raids. Things began to change very slowly. I think that Stonewall eventually, particularly in the 1970s, had a very good effect on the community. People came out more, including women. The lesbian feminist movement really encouraged women to come out as lesbian. In the lesbian feminist movement, though, the style was not butch, or I should say everyone looked butch. It was androgynous for everyone. The style was neither butch nor femme. It was simply androgynous. And it was a very exciting time. If you had been repressed in the 50s and the 60s, to suddenly see all of these bookstores, for instance, that call themselves women's bookstores, but were really lesbian bookstores, or all of these publishers that sometimes call themselves women's presses, but were really lesbian presses, and magazines devoted to a lesbian readership that had wonderful names such as Amazon and Dyke and Tribid, and just, terrific confrontational names saying this is who we are and we're not going to hide this anymore. And I think that really encouraged more and more women to come out as lesbians. And the pride parades of the 1970s really encouraged coming out. That was the whole purpose of the pride parade, to say we're here and we're not ashamed of it, and we have pride in being who we are. And that made a huge difference in people's bravery. And then, of course, the tragedy of AIDS encouraged more people to come out. Many gay men were forced out because of AIDS. But I think other gay men and lesbians, too, felt that at a time like this, with such tragedy going on, you couldn't afford to stay in the closet. You had to unite and fight. You had to come out. And so I think AIDS really brought many people out of the closet. And then the media started to change. I think we owe a lot to Ellen DeGeneres, who, although she has certainly been defamed in the last few years, was a real pioneer in opening up the subject of lesbians to the media. And it took a while, but slowly we became in the media and all over America.
So going back to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, how did that play out in lesbian nightlife?
During the 1970s, many lesbians considered themselves lesbian feminists and were very distrustful of the gay male community, really thought of gay men as being just as bad as straight men. Not all lesbians were separatists, obviously, but there was a separatist movement in the 1970s. There was a lot of hostility between the two communities. And I think with the advent of AIDS, many lesbians thought, in the face of such tragedy, we can't afford this hostility. And of course, if lesbians had a profession as early as the 1980s, many of them tended to be in the professions that women were permitted in still in the 1980s, and that was they were nurses, or they were social workers, or of course they were teachers. And nurses and social workers really knew how to navigate the medical system, and so many of them really took a part in helping gay men with AIDS. They even founded organizations such as Blood Sisters, which was a group here in San Diego. Blood Sisters was devoted to lesbians giving blood for gay men who needed transfusions. And of course, if you were a gay male, you couldn't donate blood. And so lesbians spoke for the whole gay and lesbian community by being the ones to donate blood. They started groups such as God's Love We Deliver in New York. And there were many groups that lesbians ran or volunteered in. There was Mama's Kitchen here in San Diego and Special Delivery in San Diego that was staffed very largely by lesbians who really put aside the old animosities of the 1970s, the animosities that came out of the lesbian feminist, lesbian separatist movement, and again made coalitions with gay men. And I think it was sort of a healing period for the larger community, as ironic as that was, because it was an era of huge tragedy, and yet it was also an era when many positive things happened, like the gay community realized that they could fight and they could make their voices heard as their voices had never been heard before. And of course, the coalitions where lesbians joined that fight.
And I guess the same question for the murders of Harvey Milk. I guess specifically in San Francisco, how would that have played out in the lesbian community and like in the bars specifically?
I think lesbians in San Francisco were very suspicious of Harvey Milk, who was the first out gay politician to be elected to office in California. He was not the first out gay or lesbian politician in the country. In the early 1970s, Elaine Noble was elected to the Massachusetts Assembly, and Kathy Kozachenko was elected to the Ann Arbor City Council, and they were out lesbians. That was in 74. Harvey Milk had actually run in 73. He ran again in 75, 76, and again in 77. And finally, he won in 77 and took office in 78. But lesbians had been very suspicious of him until he did something very smart, I think, by getting as his campaign manager and main assistant a woman who was very respected in the lesbian community, Anne Cronenberg. And she got lesbians on board. And then the Terrible Briggs Initiative qualified for the ballot in 78. The Briggs Initiative said that if you were a homosexual or if you said anything good about homosexuals, you couldn't work in any capacity in the public school and in any public schools in California. And Harvey Milk and others, but Harvey Milk certainly led the charge against that. But he was very smart in inviting Sally Gearhart to be with him on the podium and in debates. And then with Harvey Milk's assassination, of course, lesbians were horrified that Harvey Milk and George Moscone, who was the mayor of San Francisco, and a straight man, but very sympathetic to the lesbian and gay community, that they were assassinated. And again, I think it helped to bring more of a coalition between lesbians and gay men.
Can you briefly explain the Daughters of Blood, sort of define them?
At length. So in 1955 in San Francisco, as was true elsewhere, the bars were not only dangerous because there was a risk of bar raids, but for middle-class women, many of the bars were considered not uninteresting, but just wasn't what they wanted to do socially. And so a group of women in San Francisco decided that they would start an organization where they would meet at each other's homes and they would dance and they would talk. And that became Daughters of Bilitis that started in 1955. Several of the women who started the organization fell away, but Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon stuck with it. The organization grew. It was never huge, but it grew. And Del Martin's idea in the beginning was not that it would just be where you could go in place of the bars to dance and to chat and to have a social group, but it would also be political. But Daughters of Bilitis was not particularly political in the 1950s and through much of the 60s. It was an organization, and it had chapters in several places around the country. It was never huge, but chapters did proliferate around the country. And it was primarily a social organization. It was an alternative to the bars. And for some women, it was very, very important because the bars were dangerous, because they didn't want to drink, because it was wonderful to have a place where you could just meet other lesbians and talk.
Can you talk about the first gay pride in LA?
Yes. I had the privilege of being there. I was already a professor at Cal State Fresno, but my partner at that time and I would spend our summers in Los Angeles. So in the summer of 70, I had heard, I think through a friend, that there'd be a gay march on Hollywood Boulevard. Now, Hollywood Boulevard was very important to me because until 58, I was a student at Hollywood High School, which was on Highland, a block off of Hollywood Boulevard. And I used to hang around with gay boys, my fellow students, at Coffee Dan's, which was the corner of Hollywood and Highland. And the parade was going to pass Coffee Dan's. And so Barbara and I, the woman I was with at the time, stood in front of Coffee Dan's, and there was already a huge crowd. And it was quite incredible to me and quite healing because although we loved Coffee Dan's, I had a terrible story about Coffee Dan's, and I was going with a woman while I was still in high school. She was very butch, and she was out of a job, and I encouraged her to put on a skirt. So Frankie borrowed a tailored jacket from a gay guy, and I think she had a turtleneck shirt, but she had a skirt and borrowed some, she was a very tall woman, borrowed some heels from a gay guy. She had very short hair, and she went looking for a job at my command. That was terrible. But you know, my excuse is I was 17 years old, but it was still awful. And she didn't find a job, but we had said that at the end of the day, I guess that afternoon, when school was out, I guess at 3:00, I was going to meet her at Coffee Dan's. And some gay guy I knew came running to find me. And he said, "You have to come with me. Frankie's in trouble. She's been arrested." and we ran up to Coffee Dan's. What had happened is that they thought that she was a man masquerading as a woman because she was wearing a skirt and high heels. And so this cop came in, as the police did occasionally, just to intimidate the gay people who hung out. It was also a place where straight people went. It was a coffee shop. So this cop came in, saw Frankie, thought that Frankie was a young gay man masquerading as a woman, called a police matron who took her into the bathroom and made her strip and did awful things like made sure of her genitalia and her breasts. And so anyway, I'm not sure why I'm telling you the story, except to say that it was a hangout for us, but the police also went in there to intimidate us. And so in 1970, this was in 1957 when the Frankie incident had happened. In 1970, when I heard that there would be this parade and it would pass Coffee Dan's, Barbara and I stood right in front of Coffee Dan's, and there was the parade, and there were about 1,000 people. And it was really quite incredible that it should happen. Even in my wildest dreams, it's right. Sorry.
It's okay. I'm tearing up. It's such a beautiful story. Take your time.
I guess I'm crying over the Frankie story. Frankie's no longer with us.
Did you plan to go there to that specific spot?
Well, I heard it was going to be on Hollywood and Highland. It was going to pass Hollywood and Highland, and Coffee Dan's was on Hollywood and Highland.
Yeah.
And just down the block was my high school, Hollywood High. So of course I would stand there. Wow.
Yeah, that is so powerful. But you didn't think about like being part of the parade?
No. It was. I of course I teared up again watching it. I know, but I probably watched with an open mouth. How could this be happening? I was going to say that even in my wildest dreams, I wouldn't have thought that would happen 13 years later. How could that happen? Such quick progress, because I think of so many brave souls that said enough is enough. So there was a pride parade in 1970 in New York, and New York invited other cities to do pride parades too. There was a tiny one in Chicago. In San Francisco, it was so small that they didn't even call themselves a parade. It was kind of a march. In Los Angeles, and that was probably because of the wonderful personalities we had in Los Angeles who were already militant, like Troy Perry, who a couple of years earlier had started the Metropolitan Community Church, and Morris Kite, who had started in 1969 the Los Angeles Gay Liberation Front. I think they were the energy behind the parade, and they managed to attract 1,000 people to march in the parade. But no other cities could do that. There was New York, and there was Los Angeles, and there were the tiny demonstrations in effect in Chicago and San Francisco, and that was it. And so it's so hard to think now that there are hundreds of thousands and even 1 million and more people marching in parades in big cities and medium-sized cities all over the country and all over the world, which is incredible.
Cruising is independently reported and produced by a small but mighty team of 3. Story producer and social media manager Rachel Karp, line producer and resident road trip driver Jen McGinnity, and story producer and audio engineer me, Sarah Gabrielli. Our theme song is by Joey Freeman. You can find more at our website, cruisingpod.com, on social media at cruisingpod, or support us at buymeacoffee.com/cruisingpod. Listen to Cruising wherever you get your podcasts.